Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. So the intro, although I still am a little bit under the weather, I did get the Mark IV cleaned up and I rolled it outside as I was doing a little bit of housekeeping, a little bit of reorganization. My beautiful old stove and oven is in here in case I ever want to start doing a little bit of powder coating again. I moved a couple of shelves around, and most importantly, I got this old cabinet out from where it was buried in the corner back there, and I put it over here to put it back into service. And this cabinet, although it looks old and kind of beat up and weathered, has an incredible amount of sentimental value, as you guys can see right there. Probably 25 years old, Dad and Alex on there. Something that I think's really cool, and when I had forgotten that was on there, when I rolled it out yesterday, that kind of hit me right in the chest. So now it's positioned right here right in front of the couch. So when I'm sitting and watching some TV, I can always sit and look at that. And not quite as cool as this old writing right here, but on the inside of it, my dad's dad had gone through and done all of these handwritten notes for different service on different cars. So this cabinet has a huge amount of sentimental value, and I could not be happier to put it back into service. But reliving the past is not the point of this video. The point of this video is to do some Q&A. And this is something that I've wanted to do for a long time, and I put out the proposal or the solicitation for some questions from you guys, and you guys delivered. So I have 9 of them to go through today, and I look forward to answering them in the best manner that I can. So all of the answers that I'm going to give to these questions are just my opinion, and they're based off of my experiences. I could be wrong about everything, and don't take anything that I'm going to say as gospel. What works for me may not work for you guys, but I can at least give you my perspective and what I've found to work for me, and hopefully that can serve as a good foundation for you to build upon and develop your own process and everything else. Now I have my sheet of questions here, so rather than me running my mouth about things that aren't pertinent to the questions, as this will inevitably end up being a talking video, let's go ahead and just dive right into them. So with these 9 questions, I went ahead and I used a random number generator to randomize how I'm going to read through them. So that way I'm not prioritizing any particular question over any other ones. These are just in random order, and I'm going to answer them as such. So I'm going to also be thinking through these in real time as I'm answering them. So if there's a bunch of jump cuts or me stuttering or anything like that, just bear with me, as this is the first time I've done a Q&A session like this, and I'll try to make it as good as I can for you. So with that being said, let's go ahead and start with question number 1. And it reads, "Hey, I just wanted to say I love your videos. I learn a lot from them, and they help me with my own fabrication. I was introduced to your videos by my fabrication instructor at UNO, or the University of Northwestern Ohio. That's where I'm an alumni of, a few years back. My question for you is, do you plan on making other manifolds for different engines in the future? Well, firstly, thank you for your viewership and your support, and I'm glad to hear that the videos are making an impact at UNO. That's pretty cool. But to answer your question, I guess yes and no would be the best way I can answer it. So over the course of the time that I have built manifolds and done this type of work, I've dipped my toes into the waters of many different markets. Now, the ones that I no longer support would be the Nissan market, the Honda market, the Yamaha market, and by and large, the Mitsubishi market. And when I am determining if I'm going to build a manifold that I'll actually put into production, I sit and think about, I factor a few different variables into it. A, am I actually interested in that particular manufacturer or that model or anything along those lines? Is there a viable market for it? And are my margins great enough where my effort is worth the trouble of building the part and developing the manifold program and everything else? So I say yes and no because at this point in time, no, I'm not really looking to expand into other markets. I'm pretty happy with supporting the Chrysler as far as Neon SRT4s are concerned, that market, the few Mitsubishi manifolds that I still offer, and the obviously the Toyota 2JZ market. Those have always kind of been my bread and butter. Those have provided the greatest ROI for my efforts and the time that I spend building those parts, and that's kind of what I'm sticking with for the time being. Now, the yes portion of it comes from the fact that I can't predict the future. Now, there may be another untapped market that I have the opportunity to dip my toes into at some point in time, but at this point, right here, right now as I'm filming this, I'm not necessarily looking to expand out into different manifold markets. So maybe in the future, but right now I'm going to stick with what I do, what I know, and what, most importantly, I'm tooled up for. And to give a little bit of perspective about what it takes to build a manifold program, there's a whole lot of stuff on the front end of developing a manifold program that you don't really see on the back end. The back end, you see just a finished manifold, and everybody likes to look at that. The pretty colors, the cool shapes, etc., etc. But to get to the point when you have a completed finished manifold like that, you need to have fixtures to cut, at a bare minimum, the merge collector and the elbows, the pipe elbows that you actually are constructing the manifold out of. Beyond that, if locations are very critical, you need to have locating fixtures for wastegate flanges, for collectors, collector cutting fixtures to cut different angles and things like that into them. So it goes very quickly from it being something that could be a simple endeavor for simple manifolds to something very complex with many different steps along the way. And to do it properly and to have a repeatable process, the more facets of the process that you have fixtured, the more repeatable it's going to be and the better your end product is going to be. So that's another huge portion of why I'm hesitant to expand beyond the product lines that I already offer, and why at this point in time I'm siding with the no portion of that yes-no answer. But like I said, the yes portion may come into play at some point in time in the future. On to question number 2. And this question reads, what is the easiest way to plan for exhaust hangers and mounts? How do you mark, stabilize, and tack those pieces with consistent fitment afterwards? This is a very good question. So the way that I do it is generally working off of the factory exhaust hanger locations on cars. Now, when I'm building exhaust systems, they are generally on cars that are at least fairly OE as far as the chassis is concerned. I'm not working on a whole lot of full tube chassis pro mods or anything like that here. Most of the stuff, or most of the projects that I'm working on end up being 90s Japanese cars that are still utilizing the vast majority of the factory unibody, factory chassis architecture, and going along with that, the factory exhaust hanger locations. So in those instances, I found it best not to try to reinvent the wheel. The OEs, or the OE manufacturers, put exhaust hanger brackets and exhaust hanger provisions in locations along the bottom of the car for a reason. So it behooves me and everybody else, in my opinion, to use those factory mounting locations. Now, sometimes those have been cut off, or if they are a removable affair, they've been lost. And at that point in time, I'll kind of use logic and a best guess as to where a good location for those would be. Now, I don't like to have incredibly long runs on exhausts that are unsupported. As say that you're building an exhaust for a car and you use the V-band on the outlet of a downpipe, for example, as one hanger point, and you have another hanger the entire way in the back of the car, so you have 2 points holding the exhaust up. Now the exhaust may stay on the bottom of the car, but each bump and each movement that the exhaust is making is only supported by those 2 points. And the downpipe, in this example, being connected to the turbo, you're putting a whole lot of stress and force on not only the downpipe itself, but the turbo manifold, the studs holding the manifold to the cylinder head, and everything else, as opposed to if you had other mounting locations, then it will help to hold the weight of the exhaust up and help to keep everything in place and keep all of the force and all of the weight from being exerted just onto the downpipe and therefore the manifold and everything else. So, to answer your question a little bit better before I end up droning on forever, I try to support more where there is more weight in the exhaust. So around where the muffler would be at, where the resonator would be at, things along those lines. Where the points of the highest weight are centralized, those are the most critical locations to have additional support put in place there. At that point, you are allowing the chassis of the car to hold the exhaust up as opposed to other components, other exhaust components. As far as how do I mark, stabilize, tack those pieces with consistent fitment afterwards, the best way to do it that I've found is to do it on the car. Now, that way you can form the piece, fit it, and see that everything fits the way that you want it to on the bottom of the car. And it's a little bit more cumbersome to go underneath of the car with a welder and get in awkward positions and tack everything in. But I promise you that doing your due diligence that way, as opposed to trying to mark out, drop the exhaust out, tack it on the bench, go back, things don't fit, then you have to break tacks off, reposition, so on and so forth. It ends up being a nightmare. As opposed to if you get your rubber hanger in place, get your hanger rod going onto the exhaust bent and fit and everything else, tack it on the car with, I'll usually do at least 3, but ideally 4 good solid tacks on each individual hanger. If you tack it on the car that way, everything will stay in place. There's no guesswork involved or anything like that. And then you have your consistent fitment just based upon the process that you've used to put the exhaust hanger in place. Another important point is solid mounting an exhaust versus flexibly mounting an exhaust. And I think of this in terms of how is the engine and the transmission, or how are the engine and the transmission mounted in the car. If I'm looking at my Mark IV, for example, where the engine sits on engine plates, it is very much solid mounted to the chassis of the car. And as you rev the engine is not going to twist and rotate and move around. Something like that, I have no problem solid mounting the exhaust to the car. So the exhaust for that, it bolts onto the chassis, and there's no flex, no movement, no anything like that. If you have a car that is on, I call them floppy mounts, but even something like a hardened bushing or something like that, that still allows a little bit of movement, in that instance you really don't want the exhaust to be solid mounted. Because as the engine moves, if the exhaust doesn't, that movement has to go somewhere. And you end up flexing the exhaust or the downpipe or a manifold or something like that. And to be much more likely to end up breaking one of those parts, as opposed to if you put it on actual flexible floppy exhaust mounts, it allows that bit of movement that the whole system needs to prevent it from cracking and breaking or anything like that. So hopefully that answers your question, and that's kind of how I think about doing exhaust hangers and how and when to use different types and so on and so forth. Question number 3. This one reads, how do you maintain a perfect bevel on schedule pipe? What angle do you bevel them at to get perfect penetration? This is also another very good question. So we'll break this question down into 2 parts. And we'll start with the how do you maintain a perfect bevel portion. The best answer for that is repetition. And initially it's going to feel really weird as you're putting bevels on pipes. But the more times that you do it, you can kind of learn how it feels when you are getting your ideal bevel on the piece of pipe. And when you have that feeling memorized, then you can sit and do it almost with your eyes closed and achieve the same bevel time after time. Now, having the correct tools to do this does also help immensely. And I use the miter gauge on my belt sander to do so. And this is kind of a stop on the bottom of the sanding belt that you can set at different angles to grind different angles into the edge of the pipe. Now, one thing that I have made is this, and it looks like just a couple pieces of scrap tacked together, but this is actually a miter gauge, and this allows me to put the edge of it up onto the belt, the other edge onto the miter gauge, or the miter stop, I guess would be the better term for it. And this allows me to reset that miter stop at the bottom of the belt and provides me the ability to have that angle be repeatable, and there's no guesswork involved with it. So, the second part of the question, what angle do you bevel them at to get perfect penetration? And this may come as a shock, but I actually don't really know what the bevel angle that I use is. The numbers behind it, I've never been a huge proponent of focusing a huge amount of effort on those numbers. The same way with welder settings. The best advice that I can give for that is experiment, because what works for me may not work for you. Get yourself a section of schedule pipe, whatever you're going to be working with, and do a bunch of different experiments. Play around with different bevel angles. Play around with different ways that you are welding. Play around with all the different variables that go into it. And that will help you fall in love with the process that much more, as you should be each time you're doing one of those test welds, going through and doing the entire preparation sequence and cycle for it. That gives you reps, not only beveling, but polishing, deburring, setting up a purge, setting up to do different welds. And obviously there's all the seat time involved with sitting down and doing each individual weld. So you can practice the entire process. It will make you better at the entire process. And it gives you the opportunity to play with different bevels, with different angles and things along those lines. Now, I did just go over and measure my bevel angle because the question made me curious, and it's right around 42 degrees. So that, like I said, that's what works for me. And you can try that as a starting point for you to see how you like it or how you don't like it. And different welding processes may require different bevels. For example, doing freehand welding like what I do here, I can get away with a wider bevel as I'm spending more time filling the bevel up, as opposed to if I was running the positioner. The wider and deeper that the bevel is, the more difficult it's going to be to fill up that bevel appropriately as the piece is sitting and rotating as you're sitting and welding it. So maybe that 42 degrees, that could be a good base for you. It's something at least to try, but don't forget the point of experimenting, trying different things, and don't take just what I'm saying as gospel. Play around for yourself, see if something else works better for you, and I wish you the best of luck in your welding and fabrication endeavors. Question number 4. This one reads, how did you learn how to weld? Do you have any advice for someone who also wants to learn? So I learned how to weld initially due to necessity. So when I first started getting into cars and racing and building cars and things like that, I had no ability to weld, knew that welding existed, but it wasn't something that I was overly interested in. It just seemed like, yeah, if you need something welded, then you take it to somebody who can do it, they knock it out, you pay them, so on and so forth. And I think it took one instance of needing something welded, having to take it to a welder, wait for them to get it done, that whole process that if you guys aren't welders, or if you've dealt with welding and fabrication jobs, you are intimately aware of. And I realized that my own impatience was going to drive me insane if I had to keep going down that path and following that process. So at that point I decided this is something I need to learn how to do. I had no intent to turn it into what it is now, but I realized that it was just kind of a utility or a tool that I had to put into my tool belt to do what I wanted to do with cars and racing. And from there it went from interest to hobby to passion to obsession to business to whatever it is now. So it's been an interesting progression along the years, and the obsession portion is probably the most important but least healthy part of my progression, and we'll get into that a little bit with the second part of this question. So that's kind of the wave tops as to how I initially learned how to do it. In going through and wanting to progress and become as good at it as I possibly could be, I started paying attention to every little nuance that I possibly could and experimenting with every different variable that I could. So the old saying, Rome wasn't built in a day, or every expert was once a beginner, by no means calling myself an expert. But I was awful initially. I still remember the first time trying to weld with my initial TIG welder, not realizing that I had to create a pool of liquid metal and then start moving along, just striking an arc and starting to try to jab filler rod in there and having just a bunch of little spherical dollops of filler rod going across the piece of metal and wanting to pull my hair out. But went from that to paying attention to all the nuances once I realized what exactly I wanted to do, and that TIG welding was what I needed to learn how to do it. And just the same as anything else that I do in my life, if I get interested in it, I go and try to find the bottom of the rabbit hole, and this welding was no exception to that rule. So, do I have any advice for someone who also wants to learn? Yes, I do. So, I guess the biggest bit of advice is don't try to skip any portion of the process. I've seen frequently in the past people that they want to buy the next best cup. They want to buy the next best tool, the next hottest item, trying to skip the most important part of it, which is getting the reps in. There is no replacement for experience. And the only way you get the experience in this line of work is just by doing the thing. So don't try to skip any portion of that. You're going to be frustrated. You're going to question why you ever decided to pick up a TIG torch in the first place. You are going to question if you're capable of doing it. And as all of those negative thoughts are circulating around your head, something will click. And you'll make a little bit of progress. And that little bit of incremental progress and incremental growth it's like a drug. And that will reignite the fire inside of you. That will make you want to push even harder to have that next step and that next step and that next step. And before long, you'll be comfortable with the process and you'll start paying attention to, rather than the gross motor skills, kind of the fine nuances of it. And once you can start dialing those in, and once you start seeing the result that you want to see on the work pieces and the materials and everything that you want to work with, it is so fulfilling and it's such a cool experience. And I would give a lot to go back and have those experiences again. The obsession portion that I talked about in the first portion of this question, that's kind of a double-edged sword. And I think to a certain degree, to progress very far, not only with welding and fabrication, but any fine skill set like welding and fabrication, I guess that's kind of the best way I can think to phrase it right now, you need to be borderline, if not full-on obsessive with it. Now, you certainly need to be careful with it. Is one of the big mistakes that I made when I was initially learning is dedicating 100% of my being to welding and fabrication. And when I was younger, I missed out on a whole bunch of other actual life experiences because of it. So you have to be careful with how deep you allow that obsession to run, especially if you have other pre-existing responsibilities like a significant other, a family, another job, things like that. But the only way that I've found to really progress with anything like that is to allow yourself to be as consumed as you possibly can be with it. And if you dive into the deep end head first, you'll drown a little bit at first, but eventually you'll start to learn how to doggy paddle and then swim, and before long you'll be swimming laps like Michael Phelps. So enjoy the process, everything about it, the frustration, the losses, the victories, the elation, the everything else. And if you start doing it, stick with it, because the only way that you're going to get good at it is through experience and reps and putting the time in to actually develop the skill set rather than just expecting it to develop itself. On to question number 5. And this one reads, how do you find motivation to start on your project car? So for me, I sit and think about the end goal, and I will visualize what the car could be, could do, could sound like, kind of the whole sensory experience. That's, to me, the coolest part of it. And this may not make sense to some of you, but I get more enjoyment out of that sensory experience than I do necessarily driving the car and using it and operating it. So to be able to sit and start it and hear it and feel it and smell it and all things like that, those are things I look forward to as the greater end goal of the project. Beyond that, I relish the opportunity to sit and learn different systems and to build different parts and to try to do as good of a job as I can on each individual little facet of the project. Using the Mark IV for an example again, that gave me the opportunity to learn how so many different systems work on cars, and in learning how a dry sump system works, I now have a better understanding of how oiling systems in general work. And the ability to take science and engineering and art and design and all of these different facets and to combine them into one amalgamation of all of those different efforts is something super cool to me, and it's something that I love to share with others. So I guess the best way to answer this, how do I find motivation? I look forward to the ability to build the parts and do the work and everything like that. I look forward to sharing the end result with others and hopefully having the opportunity to teach other people the way that different systems work to the best of my knowledge and my abilities. And selfishly, I look forward to experiencing the whole sensory, not sensory overload, but the whole sensory experience, I guess, of what these cars have to offer. And at the end of it, if you can keep those things at the forefront of your mind when the project inevitably becomes frustrating, when it inevitably becomes old and irritating and everything like that, if you can sit and look at those greater goals and keep those at the forefront of your mind, then that can really help to keep providing that inspiration and that motivation to keep pushing forward with the project. No matter how insurmountable the project may seem at different points in time, you have to take it step by step, bite by bite, and eventually all those efforts will pay off, and you'll have something really cool to experience for yourself and to share with the people around you that you care about. Question number 6. This one reads, how do you handle expansion and contraction in your manifold designs? Also another very good question. So I'll break this down into 2 parts because there is the portion of expansion and contraction when you are building the manifold, and then there's the portion of expansion and contraction when it's actually put into service. So working from the foundation up, when you are initially building the manifold, you kind of have to worry about contraction more. And you'll hear people refer to this as the pipes shrinking or moving, or a variety of different ways of phrasing it. But what happens is, especially with scheduled pipe, as you weld it, the piece, say that you have a piece that is, 4 inches overall length. With the way that I weld and what I've found through my experience is if you build the piece so it fits up perfectly from flange to collector for this example. By the time that you weld everything together, those pieces will not fit. It will be much shorter than it needs to be. And I found that shrinkage, depending on the design of the primary and everything else, usually around 1/8 of an inch is what I've found here. So I played around with a variety of different ways of combating that when I was initially beginning to build manifolds. I mean, anything from trying to fixture and hold primaries in their particular length to just welding them and then putting little sliver pieces at the head flange. All kinds of different things, rather than doing the logical thing and going, hey, if it's shrinking by an 1/8 inch, why don't I overbuild the part by an 1/8 inch? And then in theory, that should pull it right back to the spot that it needs to be. Did the experiment, it worked well, and that's the process that I've used ever since. So I know I've shown it with different manifolds that I've built on the channel, but in the middle of at the end of the fabrication stage, it looks like I don't know what I'm doing. It looks like I fit everything up very poorly, and I've gotten made fun of on different social media channels multiple times because of it. But there's a reason for it. I call it purposeful misalignment, and that will generally give you the opportunity to either have it fall directly into place, or it gives you the opportunity to sit and grind and tailor fit it, as it's easier to remove material than add material. And you can sit and grind and fit and get everything to line up exactly how you want it to, and not have to do anything hokey or anything weird. So the actual functional application of expansion and contraction is I just allow it to do what it does. As metals and parts heat, they will expand. As they cool, they will contract. Simple physics. And the best way to try to combat that is to not try to combat it at all. You'll see people, they will brace a manifold. They will do all kinds of kind of snake oil type, they'll try to apply snake oil or different tonics to their manifold. And all that that's doing is prohibiting the part from moving as it naturally would. Now, if you try to stop it from moving, the movement still has to happen somewhere. And what would be, or what seems like in theory, kind of a good practical way to keep a manifold together in terms of bracing it, actually ends up hurting you in the long run by limiting the ability for the material to expand and contract as it would like to. So the best way that I found to handle that real-time, real-world dynamic expansion and contraction is just to let it do what it wants to do. Anything else, or if your welds and your fabrication are solid, if you've purged, you've used all the correct welding techniques, then you shouldn't really have anything to be afraid of. And again, if you've used the correct materials as well for it, you shouldn't have anything to be afraid of with the manifold expanding and contracting. You can't fight it. You can't fight physics that way. So you're best to just embrace it, let the part do what it wants to do, rather than trying to help it and ending up hurting yourself and breaking apart in the meantime. Question number 7. This one reads, what part of the process do you look forward to the most? Is there something you've wanted to share that you found interesting or fascinating? I like this question, as it's kind of an out-of-the-box one, and it sits and makes me think about what the manifold building process or parts building process actually is. So, what part of the process do you look forward to the most? That's hard. It's hard to pinpoint one particular part, as I look forward to the different portions of each part's build for different reasons. But I guess if I had to pick one that I like the most, I would say it's probably right after I have finished the finished welding portion of the manifold and I go to pull it off of the fixture. That's when you kind of get the first glimpse of what the finished part looks like, the fruits of your labor, the fruits of your efforts, and everything else. And you can kind of sit back, and it's the first part, or the first point, at least for me, in the manifold build process. And we use manifolds, for example, here, because that's what I've built the most of. But that's the first time in the whole process. I can sit there, look at it, and go, wow, I really just did that. That's pretty cool. And then that's immediately followed up by, well, this weld isn't as good as it could be, and I don't like this part, and so on and so forth. We're all our own harshest critics. Something that you've wanted to share that you found fascinating or interesting. Man, I think probably the biggest one, or the biggest thing that I found fascinating and interesting is oxidation. And I know that's a weird thing to say, because you hear oxidation, you think of like rust or cruddy aluminum or something along those lines. But when I say oxidation in this context, I'm talking about the beautiful colors that people sit and talk about with like a stainless turbo manifold. Now, the colors that you see on a piece of, or on a manifold weld or anything along those lines, that is just due to oxidation. So titanium anodizing is probably the best and easiest example to explain this by. But when you sit and you electroanodize a piece of titanium, as you apply different voltages, you're altering the thickness of an oxide layer that's built up on the surface of the material, and that either reinforces or cancels out the different waves of light that are interacting with the surface of the material itself and the oxide layer, and that's how you get the pretty colors off of it. And the same thing can be said for stainless. So when you sit and you weld a part, particularly stainless, where you're not overly concerned in an automotive context or the automotive sense with it having colors applied to the part, you can sit and play around with gas coverage and all the different things that are involved with gas, the flow rate, the post-flow, kind of your torch angle, how you're applying gas to the surface of it, how well the piece is shielded. And that's it has a direct correlation to the color that the part, or the color that the weld is going to be afterwards. So you can sit and I don't advise doing this, but it's fun to do as an experiment. You can sit and play around with running a little stringer bead on a piece of stainless sheet or scrap piece of stainless pipe and play around with different post-flow rates, your post-flow times. And if all other variables are the same, just changing the duration of time the gas is blowing onto the piece afterwards, you can adjust the color that the piece or that the weld comes out afterwards. And that's something that's always fascinated me. I always love beautiful, vibrant colors. I think they're gorgeous, and to have the ability in real time to play around with that on a material that is as robust as stainless pipe is something really cool. You can take something that is so industrial and apply so much artistry to it, and that crossover of industry and art is something that always has fascinated me and continues to fascinate me as I grow older. Question number 8. So this question reads, can you walk us aspiring amateurs through the design process for an exhaust or hot/cold intercooler tubing? I.e., do you plan from downpipe back or turbo forward? So let's look at this in terms of intercooler tubing, because that'll be a little bit easier example. So let's say we're looking at a cold side intercooler tube that would come out of the intercooler outlet and go into the throttle body. So generally, I don't have a particular way that I do this for every project that I work on. The chassis that I've worked more on, something like a Supra or an SRT4 or something like that, I have a particular way that I will do it. And I'll generally start from the area that will be the busiest or that has the most spatial impediments or things in the way as I possibly can, as those are the areas where you need to pay more attention to how things fit and how they run in space, as opposed to if I was trying to run just a tube through the middle of this room. There's almost no impediments that way. But if I have a 2.5 inch piece of tubing and I have a 2 3/4 inch space to fit it through, well, my efforts are better served fitting the piece through the tighter confines first and then working in the larger spaces afterwards. So I'll sit and examine the project and figure out where those tight spaces are going to be, and then initially attack those before moving on to the easier portions. So if you try to do it the opposite way, then you will end up in a pretty significant fist fight with the project that you are working on, as opposed to if you just did the hard part first, and then did the easy part second, it's all downhill by the time you get through the difficult portion. So the design process for them, with forced induction applications, not to say that there is no consideration as far as like flow characteristics or anything along those lines, but you are with pressure, with forced induction that way, being like a supercharger or a turbo, you have pressure working alongside airflow, and pressure is going to attempt to fill a conduit as opposed to just flowing through it. So with that pressure, you're pushing things as opposed to just flowing as well. So rather than like a naturally aspirated car where you have no assistance in shoving air into the air pump that is the engine, you need to be much more cognizant of the actual science in the operational engine dynamics, I guess, to church the vernacular up a little bit, than you do with a forced induction application. By no means is there no consideration with turbo or blower cars or anything like that, but it's just much more prominent and much more important with NA stuff. But you can use some pretty simple design principles where when you can, or anywhere you can, use long radius bends to stop the fluid that is the air from making abrupt changes in direction. It will probably behoove you to do that. When things are merging together, having them, if you think about a merge collector being a V, like my two fingers are right here, and things are flowing from these knuckles down to the tips of my fingers. If you have things merge in a more vertical fashion this way, all of the energy, or as much of the energy as possible that is flowing through them, is actually going in your intended end direction, as opposed to if you widen that out, the fluid will flow and collide in the center, and that's how you cause turbulence and some inefficiencies with what you're doing. So in a perfect world, we could build everything out of long radius bends and have everything be perfectly equal lengths and all of that. But the world isn't perfect, and you're always going to be working around some spatial confines and spatial restrictions in the engine bay. So it's best to identify those initially and develop at least a rudimentary plan of how to work around them, attack the difficult portions of those spatial constraints first, and then work downhill, work on the easy portions secondly, and you'll thank yourself throughout the whole process, and you'll end up with a better end product that way in the long run. And last but not least, question 9. And this one reads, what is your opinion on the best budget starter TIG machine? So let me preface my answer to this by saying I don't pay a massive amount of attention to what new machines are out on the market, what new brands there are, anything like that. I've been a Miller guy for a long time. I've had my trusty Dynasty behind me here for, oh man, it's probably been 10 or 12 years at this point in time. And if I'm being honest, I've only had one other TIG machine other than this that also was a Miller. Now, my experience with running different TIG machines, I have a handful that I've used, but I'm by no means as well versed as some other welder fabricators in all of the different brands and models and features and everything else. It's frankly just, it isn't something that I'm overly concerned with on a daily basis because I don't have to be with the Dynasty. But I'll do my best to answer this question, and I think there are a few different decent options out there for it. So the term or the word budget in here, that's a little bit subjective, as what would be budget for me may not be what would be budget for you, and what may be budget for you may not be budget for somebody else. So initially, you have to define what budget is for yourself. But I'll frame this in terms of kind of machines that are on the cheaper end and that may not have all of the bells and whistles that something like the Dynasty would, but are still capable, and they're still capable machines that can get the job done. So, being partial miller, I'll start with them. What I started off with was a Diversion 165. That's their absolute base level welder. I'm not sure if they still offer them or not, but if they do, they had a Diversion 165 and a Diversion 180. I went with the 165. I was very happy with the machine, welded nice and smooth. Didn't have all kinds of different features or anything like that that would make it difficult when you were initially starting to learn how to weld or how to TIG weld. You don't want to sit and have all these different features and all these different things to balance and figure out what they do and what they mean. At that point, you should be more focused on just the actual mechanics of welding itself and not be overly reliant on all of the different features for the machine. That'll come later on. Initially, just focus on running the machine. But I wouldn't have any issue with somebody getting into one of those diversions, although they are certainly more of a hobbyist machine. Now, if you want to step up a little bit from there, the Miller Synchrowave series has always been really good, and I've ran those a pretty decent amount when I was at UNO. I think we had Synchrowave 210s when I was there. And again, nice smooth running machines, not a whole bunch of different features to sit and play around with, which can be an impediment as you get farther on in your welding career. But initially, you don't need all of that, and you just need a machine that is good, smooth running, and that does what it should do so you can develop good habits and build from there. Lincoln's offerings, I've ran a few of their smaller TIG welders. I've never been super satisfied with the kind of the arc characteristics and arc stability. Granted, that could be the power input that the machines had at the given shops that I was running them at. But they always, for me, kind of left a little bit to be desired. So I'd probably steer people away from those a little bit. But I'll kind of eat my words a little bit with what I'm about to say, because of all places, the Harbor Freight Vulcan welders, I've ran those before and have been really immensely satisfied with them. And I'm probably going to buy one as a secondary TIG machine for here at some point in time. And like anything else at Harbor Freight, it's a direct knockoff of something else. And their Vulcan welders, they happen to be direct knockoffs of Lincoln welders. So for whatever reason, with my dissatisfaction with the Lincoln TIG welders that I have used, the Vulcan welder that I have ran before, I was really satisfied with it. It ran smooth, predictably, everything else, and you really can't beat the price point for those machines. I wouldn't get one of them if I was running a production weld shop, and that's why here my primary welder is the old Dynasty over there as opposed to something like the Vulcan welder. But for a hobbyist or a weekend warrior, something like that, I'd have no issue recommending it. Now, the elephant in the room is the Everlast welders. And the reason I haven't said anything about those yet is because I have no hands-on experience with them. However, I know there are a large number of welder fabricators out there that run Everlast machines. I don't hear very many bad things about them. I believe their customer service and customer support is supposed to be really good. But, like I said, I have not dealt with any of that firsthand. So this is all second, third hand, and at that point in time, it may as well be conjecture. Another reasonable option out there for you may be one of the Eastwood TIG machines. I've ran one of them before. I don't recall the number of features or number of different adjustments or anything they had on them, but I don't recall being upset about the way the machine ran. I seem to recall it being smooth and predictable and everything else. I know the price point on them is generally pretty good. I think it's somewhere between $1,000 and $2,000. If I remember correctly, don't quote me on that, but that may be another decent thing to look into. There's other brands out there like Fronius, ESAB. Oh man, I'm sure the list goes on. I'm not super well versed in the different offerings out there right now. But the biggest thing and the biggest bit of advice is finding something that gives you a bit of room to grow as your skill set increases and your capabilities increase within whatever budget you can set for yourself. Obviously, if you have more money to play with, you can buy yourself a more capable machine, but that may not be the case for everybody. So try to do the most with the amount of money that you have. Try to buy the best machine that you can for the amount of money that you have. And again, best is kind of a subjective term as well, but hopefully that gives you a little bit of guidance for what to look for and what a few different options may be. Like I said, I'm partial to my blue Miller welders, but there are other good options out there. And the biggest thing is, or the biggest point that I have not made yet is, do not buy 110 volt TIG welders. They are generally lift arc, which means no pedal control or anything like that. And they are very, very anemic with their power output. And in addition to that, generally they are only able to be used on the DC side of things as opposed to AC. So you won't be able to weld aluminum or anything like that with them. And generally they just are not a good option. I know that they are cheap and they are convenient, not having to have a 220 circuit ran or anything like that. But as tempting as it may be to buy one of those, please do yourself the favor and do not give in to that temptation. So hopefully that answers your question, or at least gives you some bit of direction on where to start looking for TIG machines or anything like that. And the best thing to do would be just to research and figure out what the most feature-rich machine you can get for the amount of money that you have to play with is, but not allow yourself to be overly consumed with those features when you initially get the machine. Those are there for later for you to grow into. So there we have it, Q&A round 1 in the books. So thank you guys very much for submitting all of those questions. I had a lot of fun going through them, and you guys made me think a little bit as I was going through, and some of the things are things I have not thought about for a long time. And you kind of get to the point of complacency and monotony when you do any type of work for any long duration of time. And unfortunately, that's kind of the point that I've been at for a while. You start to take things for granted. But when you have to sit and think and actually break down why you do the things you do and answer questions about that, it makes you think, and it makes you better at your craft. So thank you guys very much for submitting the questions, for giving me the opportunity to answer them for you. And hopefully you guys like this video. And if you do, please let me know in the comments, and it's something we can include as a regular segment, regular feature on the channel. And again, all of these answers are just my opinions, the same as anybody else doing a Q&A like this. So hopefully it gives you some guidance. Please don't take any of it 100% to heart. And if you have any other questions, then I will be soliciting for questions again in the not too distant future when I'm gearing up to do round 2 of Q&A. So with all of that being said, I think that will be about the end of this episode. So again, thank you guys very much for submitting questions, and hopefully we can do it again in the very near future. But beyond that, thank you guys as always for tuning in and coming along on all these different adventures and journeys with me. Now, we have a lot to look forward to with the Mark II coming up very soon. Can't wait to get started on this radiator, and that will be the subject of the next episode. So this thing is coming to, or not coming to a close, but we are wrapping up and doing more things with it with each succeeding episode. I'm having a lot of fun bringing this car back to life, and I hope that you guys are enjoying the journey with me. So with all of that being said, I think that will be about the end of this episode. So as always, be sure to subscribe, leave a like, leave a comment, check out the website for manifolds, for merch, for all things good that way. And I will see you all in the next episode.